posed for the camera. On the 10th of November, 1898, a crowd of white men stood before the smoking brick shell of a newspaper office in Wilmington, North Carolina, and let their picture be taken. Rifles in hand, hats tilted back, entirely unafraid. They had just burned the only black-owned daily newspaper in the United States. Before the day was out, they would drive an elected city government from office at gunpoint and install their own leader as mayor. They smiled because they believed no one would ever call it a crime. For 100 years, they were right. Wilmington, 1898. The Coup, America buried. To understand what was destroyed, you first have to see what stood. In 1890, Wilmington was the largest city in North Carolina, a busy Atlantic port on the Cape Fear River. And it was a black majority city, some 11,000 black residents to fewer than 9,000 white. This was not a subjugated population living at the edge of town. It was a community with power, political, economic, and its own printed voice, of a kind the post-war South was supposed to have made impossible. That power was visible in the halls of government. 3 of the city's aldermen were black. Black men sat as justices of the peace and served as policemen, mail clerks, and a deputy clerk of court. And at the port itself, John Dancy, a black man, held the federal post of collector of customs, with a salary larger than the governor's. To the white newspapers, an accomplished black official was not a citizen. He was an insult. They mocked him as the Sambo of the custom house. The power was economic, too. Black Wilmingtonians owned 10 of the city's 11 restaurants and most of its barbershops, and made up a third of its skilled craftsmen. A black broker named Thomas Miller held white men in his debt, and 2 brothers, Alexander and Frank Manley, ran the Daily Record, by most accounts the only black-owned daily newspaper in the entire country. A city where black citizens voted, prospered, published, and governed. To the men who ran the state, that was the offense. And it had been built at the ballot box. A coalition called Fusion, poor white populists joined with mostly black Republicans, had swept North Carolina in 1894 and 1896, electing the first Republican governor since Reconstruction. To the state's Democratic leaders and Wilmington's business elite, this was intolerable, not because it had failed, but precisely because it worked. A working multiracial democracy was the one thing they could not allow to stand. So they set out to end it, not in a sudden rage, but by design. In the closing months of 1897, 9 of Wilmington's most prominent men began meeting in secret to plan the city's overthrow. History remembers them as the Secret Nine. They were not a mob. They were bankers, merchants, and lawyers, and they gave themselves the better part of a year to prepare. Their instrument was the Democratic Party, and its campaign that year had a single theme: white supremacy, stated in exactly those words. The party chairman, Furnifold Simmons, built a machine he described as men who could write, speak, and ride. The writers and speakers would supply the message. The riders would supply the fear. And the message was that North Carolina faced a crisis its leaders called Negro domination.
North Carolina is a white man's state, and white men will rule it, and we will crush the party of Negro domination beneath a majority so overwhelming that no other party will ever again dare to establish Negro rule here. Furnifold Simmons, chairman of the Democratic Party of North Carolina in the campaign of 1898.
There was no such crisis. It had to be manufactured, and the man who manufactured it was Josephus Daniels, editor of the Raleigh News and Observer. Day after day, his paper printed invented outrages and racial panic, illustrated by the savage cartoons of Norman Jennett. One showed a giant black vampire, labeled Negro Rule, spreading its wings over the white people of the state. It was, one historian would later write, among the most effective disinformation campaigns of its age. Daniels never denied it.
I do not know how we could have gotten along in the campaigns of 1896 and 1898 without Gennett's cartoons. Josephus Daniels, editor of the News and Observer, recalling the campaign years afterward.
And then came the rioters. Armed white horsemen called red shirts rode in columns through black neighborhoods, firing into homes and at a black schoolhouse to drive the message home. In the weeks before the vote, the white leadership bought a rapid-fire machine gun and mounted it on a wagon. The campaign of persuasion had become, openly, a campaign of terror. Every manufactured crisis needs a spark, and the campaign found one in an old speech. The year before, a Georgia writer named Rebecca Latimer Felton had stood before a farmers' society and offered white men a prescription for protecting white women. A prescription of pure violence.
If it needs lynching to protect woman's dearest possession from the ravening human beasts, then I say lynch 1,000 times a week, if necessary. I am Rebecca Latimer Felton, before the Georgia Agricultural Society in the year 1897.
Her words were reprinted across the South, and in Wilmington, one editor answered them. Alexander Manly, light-skinned, and by his own account, the grandson of a former North Carolina governor, replied in the Daily Record. He rejected the lie that every accusation against a black man was true, and named the hypocrisy of white men who policed black conduct while abusing black women. It was measured. It was also, in the climate of 1898, an act of extraordinary courage.
Every Negro lynched is called a big, burly, black brute, when in fact many of those who have thus been dealt with had white men for their fathers, and were not only not black and burly, but were sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them, as is well known to all. Alexander Manly, in the Daily Record, the 18th of August, 1898.
The Democratic press had been handed its weapon. For nearly 3 months, Manly's editorial was reprinted, rewritten, and read aloud across the state as proof of the Black Menace, the Wilmington Messenger calling it the famous and infamous editorial. Few who raged about it had read what Manly actually wrote. It did not matter. The pretext had been built, and it had Manly's name on it. The campaign needed a voice for its final act, and it found one in Alfred Moore Waddell. A former Confederate officer and ex-congressman, Waddell was 64, out of office, and deep in debt. The white supremacy campaign was his road back to power, and he took it. Days before the election, he stood in Wilmington's Thalian Hall and told a roaring crowd exactly what he was prepared to do.
We will never surrender to a ragged raffle of Negroes, even if we have to choke the current of the Cape Fear River with carcasses. Alfred Moore Waddell, at Thalian Hall, the 24th of October, 1898.
On the eve of the election, he was more direct still. The instruction was no longer to win votes. It was to stop them from ever being cast.
Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls, and if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks. We shall win tomorrow if we have to do it with guns. Alfred Moore Waddell, the 7th of November, 1898.
On Election Day, the red shirts blocked the roads, turned black voters away, and stuffed the boxes. The returns that came back were impossibly, obviously fraudulent. And yet the day passed without a single act of the black violence the campaign had promised was coming. There was no uprising. The pretext had failed to appear. One white resident of the city long remembered the quiet of that morning.
I awoke that morning with a thankful heart that the election had passed without the shedding of the blood of either the innocent or the guilty. I heard the colored people going by to their work, talking cheerfully together, as had not been the case for many days. Jane Cronley, a white resident of Wilmington, 1898.
It did not save them. The organizers had planned for victory at the polls to be only the beginning, On the morning of November 9th, some 600 white men packed the county courthouse, and Waddell rose to read a document they called the White Declaration of Independence. 457 men signed it. It announced that the white citizens of Wilmington would no longer be ruled by men of African descent, and it issued an ultimatum.
We will no longer be ruled, and we will never again be ruled by men of African origin. We demand that the record cease to be published and that its editor be banished from this community, that he leave this city forever within 24 hours. From the White Declaration of Independence, Wilmington, the 9th of November, 1898.
That evening, 32 of the city's black leaders, the Committee of Colored Citizens, were summoned to answer for it. They had no power to shut a newspaper they did not own, but they understood the threat in the air. A young attorney named Armand Scott drafted a careful, conciliatory reply, promising to use their influence to see the demand met, and asking only for peace.
We are in no way responsible for, nor do we in any way condone, the obnoxious article. But in the interest of peace, we will most willingly use our influence to have your wishes carried out. The Committee of Colored Citizens of Wilmington, the 9th of November, 1898.
Fearing the letter would be intercepted, Scott chose to deliver it by hand and left it in Waddell's mailbox. Whether Waddell ever truly failed to receive it, no one can say. What is certain is that it changed nothing. That same night, Alexander Manley, warned that a rope was waiting for him, slipped out of Wilmington in the dark. He would never live there again. On the morning of November 10th, Waddell announced that no satisfactory reply had come. By 8:15, some 500 armed men had gathered at the armory of the Light Infantry. Waddell led them through the streets to the office of the Daily Record. They broke in, doused it with kerosene, and set it ablaze, and when the fire had done its work, they arranged themselves before the ruins for a photograph. By then, the crowd in the streets had swelled toward 2,000. What began as arson became a massacre. In the black neighborhood of Brooklyn, shots were exchanged, no one agrees who fired first, and then white riflemen and the rapid fire gun on its wagon opened on black residents who had almost no way to arm themselves in return. Men were shot in the streets and shot as they ran. The killing went on through the afternoon and into the night. A black minister, the Reverend J. Allen Kirk, survived to describe what he had seen.
Firing began, and it seemed like a mighty battle in wartime. The shrieks and screams of children, of mothers, of wives were heard. Thousands of women, children, and men rushed to the swamps, and there lay upon the earth, in the cold, to freeze and to starve. The Reverend J. Allen Kirk, an eyewitness. Wilmington, 1898.
While the shooting went on outside, the coup was completed indoors. That afternoon, armed men forced the mayor, the entire board of aldermen, and the chief of police to resign, one by one, at gunpoint. In their place, a board handpicked that very morning was seated, and it elected Alfred Moore Waddell mayor of Wilmington before the sun went down. The man who had led the mob now held the city. The whole overthrow had taken a single day. The purge came next. Over the following days, black leaders and their white fusionist allies were pulled from their homes, marched to the railroad station under armed guard, and put on trains out of the state, forbidden to return. One white ally was nearly lynched before he was shoved aboard a northbound car. And behind the banished came an exodus. In the weeks that followed, roughly 2,100 black residents fled Wilmington for good. A black majority city was made a white one, on purpose.
Things are stirred up, and I am glad to say I am still living. But we have not killed enough Negroes. 2 or 3 white men were wounded, and we have not gotten enough to make up for it. Jack Metz of the Wilmington Light Infantry, in a letter of the 12th of November, 1898.
How many died, no one will ever know. The county coroner counted about 14. A century later, the state's official commission concluded the dead may have numbered as many as 60. Other estimates run higher still, into the hundreds, figures that can no longer be proven. Every documented victim was black. Not one white death was recorded. The count is uncertain by design as much as by chaos. Some were buried in unmarked graves, some bodies were never found, and the men who did the killing spent the next century deciding what the record would say. Because the killing was only half of it. The true prize was the vote, and Wilmington became the template for taking it. Within a year, North Carolina passed its first Jim Crow law. Within 2, a new state constitution imposed a poll tax and a literacy test with a grandfather clause carefully written to disqualify black men while sparing whites. The effect was engineered and immense. In 1896, some 126,000 black North Carolinians were registered to vote. By 1902, roughly 6,000 remained.
This was not the act of rowdy or lawless men. It was the act of merchants, of manufacturers, of railroad men, an act in which every man worthy of the name joined. Charles Aycock, campaign orator and governor of North Carolina, defending the coup in 1900.
And the men who planned and led it were not punished. They were promoted. Waddell kept the mayor's office for years. Simmons went to the United States Senate and stayed for 3 decades. Aycock became governor. Josephus Daniels, the propagandist, was made Secretary of the Navy. President McKinley never intervened. A federal inquiry closed with not one indictment. And the nation's newspapers reported that Wilmington's government had simply and lawfully changed hands.
The Board of Aldermen resigned in response to public sentiment. The entire board was changed legally. The New York Times, in its reporting of November 1898.
Then the victors sat down to write the history. Respected North Carolina historians would record 1898 as a justified rising of white men against Negro misrule, the version taught for generations under a single disarming word, riot. It implied something spontaneous, two-sided, and black-provoked. It was none of those things. Not until a black scholar named Helen Edmonds challenged that story in 1951 and was attacked for doing it did the correction even begin. It took 100 years. On the centennial, the state of North Carolina at last convened a commission to find the truth. Its report, in 2006, reconstructed in hard detail the coup that had been called a riot. A memorial rose in Wilmington. A journalist's account of the massacre won the Pulitzer Prize. And in 2021, a man named Joshua Halsey, shot dead in 1898 and buried in an unmarked grave, was found and given a headstone and a funeral 123 years late. The men who overthrew Wilmington won twice, once with rifles and once with the story they were allowed to tell. It has taken far longer to undo the second victory than it took to win the first. The state that once called it a riot now calls it what it was, a coup, the violent overthrow of a duly elected American government hidden in plain sight for a century. To remember it accurately is the smallest justice still left to offer. It is not nothing. This has been Ember and Ash, forgotten American history. If this story moved you, carry it forward. And we will see you at the next one.